Hey everybody, welcome to Chapter 17, Lesson 1, where we begin our discussion of the Vietnam War. And our essential questions for this lesson and this section on Vietnam, there's two. How does military conflict divide people within a culture, people that live together? How does it divide them in what ways? And then, should citizens support government during wartime? And really, this question could even be one of the reasons, or the answer to this question could even be one of the things that divide a people within a culture during a time of war. So on this first slide, what we're going to look at here is kind of the backstory of Vietnam, why America even cares about Vietnam to begin with. What's the rationale? What's the purpose behind it? Why do we get involved? And then it'll see us here early on in the history of Vietnam taking and giving support to some unlikely allies, a group called the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh. And what we'll see is that our support of them is going to be unusual. And so why would that be? Why would our support of the Viet Minh be unusual? And I think we need to go all the way back to help us understand this. We need to go all the way back to 1877, when France is out colonizing other places around the world, looking for natural resources and markets for its goods. And it discovers and stumbles on a group of countries that we know today as Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia. And it calls these countries together French Indochina. That's what it calls it. That this is French Indochina. And it remains conquered and run by France all the way up to 1941. And this really makes some Vietnamese extraordinarily angry. It really upsets them that they are ruled so by this kind of colonial power, and it prevents them from having and living and doing their own thing. One of the guys that is actually made very angry about this. One of the guys that really is upset by this living arrangement is this guy right here. His name's Ho Chi Minh. And Ho Chi Minh is going to begin to develop ideas around resisting the French colonization of Vietnam. But all of that is put on hold when 1941 rolls around, because during World War II, especially during 1941, 42, 43, 44, and 45, Indochina is going to come underneath Japanese control. The French, when they end up surrendering to Germany, will cede control of French Indochina to the Japanese. And this is going to kind of put a freeze on whatever plans Ho Chi Minh had with France, because they don't control the country anymore. So step one, the first thing to realize here, take a look at this graphic organizer together, is that Vietnam had first been conquered by the French and then conquered by the Japanese in World War II. That's the kind of first two things to understand. Ho Chi Minh, this leader who is a communist in Vietnam, he decides to organize a communist rebel army called the Viet Minh. And I'd like you to actually write that in your notes on the right-hand side, Viet Minh Communist Rebel Army. And we actually send help to the Viet Minh to fight the Japanese. Remember that during World War II, Japan is our enemy. So even if a communist group wants to fight them, we're going to support that communist group. And don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, we were allied with the Communist Soviet Union during World War II, so it's normal for us to support other communist groups that are fighting our enemies as well. That all will change when World War II ends and we enter the Cold War, because when France tries to reconquer Vietnam, come back in after the Japanese are gone, and when they try to come back in, we're going to work against the Viet Minh in an attempt to help France retake French Indochina. And they drive the Viet Minh into hiding, France does, as it starts to win this war. But then, as the Viet Minh flee into the countryside, the French begin struggling against a new type of warfare called guerrilla warfare. And a guerrilla warrior is a person who belongs to an armed band that carries out surprise attacks and sabotage. It's not traditional warfare. You hit a target and you run away. You might even be a civilian. You might not, you might even spend your days working in the fields and in the farms. And then at nighttime, you take up a gun and you go out and you fight the enemy. And they really struggle with this, so that by 1954, France has almost been pushed entirely out of Vietnam. So from 1946 to 1954, France will try and reclaim Vietnam, but it's unable to do so. Only the areas here in gray are controlled by the French. Everything else that you see in red is controlled by the Viet Minh and their leader, Ho Chi Minh. President Eisenhower is really worried about this because he's afraid that if Vietnam becomes communist, that means that all the other countries that used to be a part of French Indochina will become communist too, right? So if communist Vietnam happens, then maybe Laos and Cambodia will go communist too, and that would be terrible. Remember, we're looking to contain those nations. And Eisenhower calls this the domino theory. He says, if Vietnam falls to communism, so will those other nations like Laos and Cambodia. So where is this going to take us then with this fear that the French are going to lose, the French are not going to be able to beat the Viet Minh, and that they'll be kicked out of Vietnam and it will become communist? And the answer to that question is actually going to be solved by a key battle that happens right here where this little gun is, a battle of Dien Bien Phu, as it's called. And at that battle, the French make a major effort. They push into Vietnam, and they try to capture some of the most important Viet Minh locations. And what happens instead is the French are surrounded and captured and killed. And this massive defeat finally causes the French to say, forget it, we've had enough, we're getting out of Vietnam. And what they do is they go to Geneva, Switzerland. The Viet Minh go and the French go. And they sign something called the Geneva the Geneva Accords. And what you're going to see with the Geneva Accords is that Vietnam is temporarily going to be split between a communist North right there, and a democratic South right there. And the idea is that eventually they're going to have elections, North Vietnam led by Ho Chi Minh, South Vietnam led by another dictator called Ngo Dinh Diem. And those Geneva Accords will give us free elections, and Korea will unite, all one thing or all the other. Or not Korea, rather. Vietnam will unite, all one thing or all the other. It'll be either an all-communist Vietnam or an all-democratic dictatorship, or I should say all under a dictatorship of South Vietnam. So that's the plan. The problem, though, is that fear takes over. Remember, we had said, how does military conflict divide people within a culture? Well, the answer here is going to be that it's not just that we used to give support to the communists, but Ngo Dinh Diem is afraid to hold those elections in South Vietnam. He's afraid that he'll lose power. He's afraid that as a result of his losing power, that all of Vietnam will become communist. So he refuses to hold the elections. He says, I'm not doing it. I'm not going to hold those elections. And Ho Chi Minh, all the way up there in North Vietnam, right? Ho Chi Minh up here in Hanoi, North Vietnam, he says, all right, we have to do something. If we're going to have this whole area up here, then what we need to do is we need somebody fighting on our behalf in South Vietnam. So here's what's going to happen. The Viet Minh are going to become the North Vietnamese army. So the old guerrilla army that had been fighting against the French, that old guerrilla army under the Geneva Accords is now going to become the army of North Vietnam. And since Ngo Dinh Diem and the South Vietnamese won't hold those elections because they're afraid all of Vietnam will be communist, Hanoi is going to say, we need someone to go out there and make a new guerrilla army in South Vietnam. And they send leaders and trainers down into South Vietnam, and they create a new guerrilla army in South Vietnam called the Viet Cong. And what I need you to understand here as we take a look at this is that the Viet Cong are just regular people. They're just regular people doing their own thing. They're not crazies. They're just regular people. Most of them are farmers by day. And at night they take up weapons and fight against South Vietnam because they want to join North Vietnam and become communist. You can see, look at their dress. There's no real uniform among them. They might have some parts of a uniform, but no one real uniform among them. They have only limited weapons and supplies because they're only out at night. They arrive at night, they fight small battles, they sabotage, they surprise you, and then they're gone. And in the morning, they might be your best friend. You might not even know that your best friend is someone that is fighting for the Viet Cong because they want all of Vietnam to become communist. And they use, and they're very successful. They're very successful. And we fear their success. So we begin to send military advisors to Vietnam. And the dictator of South Vietnam responds ruthlessly. He's going to outlaw religions that people traditionally practice in Vietnam. Remember, this dictator is Catholic, and he's not going to want anyone to practice any religion other than Catholicism. His army will burn, destroy, terrorize in order to have victory. He even takes people and he moves them into these things called strategic hamlets. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people are supposed to be moved into these strategic hamlets. And you can see that they've got guardhouses and watchtowers and guard posts and trenches and areas where people will end up living in their different zones. And you can see, here's one actually from the air, a strategic hamlet. And it will take people, thousands of people, away from their homes. It'll take them away from their land, away from their crops, and it will force them to live under lock and key. Of course, the idea here is that if you live under lock and key, if you live inside a strategic hamlet and you can't get out, well, then I know that you're not one of the Viet Cong. Right? That's how I know who is and who isn't a part of the Viet Cong. That's the idea, anyway. This, of course, makes his people particularly angry. In South Vietnam, the people have a tremendous connection to the land. Their ancestors are believed to inherit and inhabit the land and the area around them. So to take people away from that would be to take them away from their ancestral beliefs. It's a big deal. So what we'll end up seeing here is that in Ngo Dinh Diem's policies, people will begin to protest. People will begin to fight out. They'll strike out. They'll lash out. And that eventually he'll actually end up being assassinated because he becomes so unpopular with his attempts to keep the Viet Cong from turning South Vietnam all communist. Now, if you notice, there's one person missing here, one big group missing here, and that's the United States. And the reason that we don't see the United States present yet is that until we end up being attacked, all we're going to do is send some advisors to try and keep South Vietnam from going communist. Well, that attack happens in 1964, in August, when there's an attack on some naval vessels in a place called the Gulf of Tonkin, which is just off of the coast of North Vietnam. And that resolution that's passed, that Congress says is going to be that President Johnson can use any means necessary to win the war in Vietnam. And that means that the war is going to become incredibly destructive. On one side, in South Vietnam, you'll have the Viet Cong guerrilla army using absolutely vicious numbers of booby traps. I'll put some of them up here on the screen. Booby traps like you see right here, where you step on, this would be covered right here with leaves and grass, and then when you step on it, the leaves and grass fall through, and your body hits this, and you slide into this, and these rollers kind of roll as you slide down, and they pierce your body way up as you go up. As your body falls in, it gets pierced in multiple places. This one here has stakes sharpened at the bottom, oftentimes smeared with fecal matter from animals or humans to cause infection when you would step on it and fall through, and then you'd be pierced by these stakes. Or here, these grenades, which are tied and hidden amongst the foliage, so just as you're walking along at head height, and you bump into the wrong branch, and the pin falls out of the grenade, and everyone ends up near you getting injured or worse. In fact, the main goal of a Vietnamese booby trap is not to kill, it's to injure, because by injuring one person, you take at least two out of the fight, the one who's injured and the one who's caring for the person who's injured. So oftentimes they would just terribly use these silent booby traps, waiting to get our troops in the day or in the night. In return, we use terrible weapons as well. We'll look at Agent Orange tomorrow in class to kill the entire jungle, but one of the ones that we use is something called napalm, which I know we talked about when we did World War II, that jellied gasoline that we use to burn out the jungle, to burn out the Viet Cong when we can't see them in the incredibly dense forest, in the incredibly dense jungle. We drop napalm on it and we burn them out. It forces them to retreat. Napalm is still used. So, for example, here is some jellied napalm, which has actually been dropped in this case in Syria today in the Syrian civil war. So napalm is still used in the Syrian civil war. In fact, that's your word, I think, for this lesson, Syria. Syria. So, we certainly fight the war in terrible ways. We certainly will do what we can to fight back as they fight us in very difficult ways. We certainly fight the war in difficult ways as well. But we face a number of problems in this war, which is that most South Vietnamese people want the Viet Cong to win. Most South Vietnamese people want the Viet Cong to win, and they want to join North Vietnam. They want to be communist. The other is that the North Vietnamese army helps the Viet Cong. And they do so by way of a series of supply chains and networks called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And I have a map of it here for you, and it's in two different colors, in black and in yellow. So what you'll see in black are big truck paths, big truck trails, and then in yellow are footpaths. And so what you'll see is huge amounts of supplies will leave North Vietnam on these trucks, and they will travel on these truck paths, which are in black, throughout Laos and Cambodia, heading towards South Vietnam. You might even see supplies carried on elephant back on these kind of bigger, large roads. And then they're going to get to these footpaths. Once they hit these large roads, once they can't go any further, you'll see them on these small paths where bicycles are used, where people walk on foot, and they bring these supplies into South Vietnam in order for the Viet Cong to have the materials they need to fight the United States. And President Johnson won't even allow a full-scale attack on the Ho Chi Minh Trail because he's afraid that other countries will get involved in the war. I mean, look, this is a war that America's fighting in South Vietnam against rebels. And we're not fighting North Vietnam. We're fighting in South Vietnam against rebels. That's the Vietnam War, at least in the beginning. The Vietnam War is a war against rebels in South Vietnam. So why would we go bombing Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, North, if they're not officially in the war? We don't want to broaden the war. It has limited goals, a limited objective, because it's a limited war. The problem, of course, here is that North Vietnam is getting the weapons and materials it needs to send to the South from the Soviet Union, which is way up here, and from China, which is right here. So the weapons and the supplies are coming from the Soviet Union and China. They're heading to North Vietnam. Then they're getting on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They're heading to the Viet Cong in the South, where they're used to kill American service personnel. So President Johnson is going to say, look, I know the Viet Cong are getting their supplies from North Vietnam. I know North Vietnam's getting its supplies from China and the Soviet Union. But if we invade North Vietnam to shut down the supply chain, that could bring China or even the Soviet Union into the war. We can't do that. Essentially, President Johnson's fighting this war with both legs and one arm tied behind his back. He can't fight North Vietnam because he's worried about China. Can't fight China because he's worried about the Soviet Union. Can't fight in Laos or Cambodia because he's worried about those nations joining the war, maybe even becoming communist in general. It's a real mess. Johnson's in a really difficult place, and those limits make it hard to win. As a result, and here's what's interesting, this isn't a war about capturing territory. Remember, we already have the territory. It's South Vietnam. This is a war about body counts. It's how many Viet Cong can you kill? If we kill enough of them, there won't be any more. If we kill them fast enough, high enough numbers, there won't be any more. That's the goal. That's going to make it incredibly difficult to fight and win this war in the long term. And we'll talk more about that in the coming lessons.